Welcome to our podcast, Raising Bigs. This podcast is an ongoing conversation between myself and my young adult son. We're ready and willing to talk about all the things families might experience in their lives and relationships, both as parents and young adults, from teens to 20-somethings, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. One potential source of conflict between parents and their bigs is expectations. Everyone has them for themselves and others, but the parent and big relationship dynamic is a unique one. Up until a certain point, parents hold an awful lot of power over their child, while the child is wishing that power would be turned over to them. It creates a pull away from each other, a natural process of pulling away that can be tough at best. When it's made even harder than it needs to be due to expectations not being worked through effectively, it can be downright awful. Parents might have the expectations that their young adult believes are unreasonable. Bigs might expect certain things out of their parents that aren't in alignment with parental actions or beliefs. Whether you aren't meeting someone else's expectations or someone isn't meeting yours, it's not pleasant and disagreements may ensue. Let's dive in. I'm Marci and I'm the mom.
I'm Cade, and I'm her kid. I'm sure most bigs can tell you what they think their parents expect of them. However, sometimes these expectations aren't clearly defined, and we just think these are the set expectations that our parents have. When a young adult falls short, there can be consequences, from pressure to conform and to some pretty stiff punishments, depending on the action. I know kids have expectations of their parents which may or may not be communicated well or even be realistic. Most people don't want to hurt or disappoint those they love, so let's talk about how bigs and parents can better handle their expectations of each other and how to avoid that conflict. So, Mom, to kind of start it off, how do you kind of gauge and how do you know if expectations are appropriate? Both, a big giving expectations to their parents and a parent giving an expectation to their big.
I think, as a parent, one of the things I've done to make sure that my expectations, right, are not out of alignment, right, with who I am as a person, number one, and my value set. But also, I think it's really easy as a parent sometimes just to get angry when you either are disappointed in your child or you feel embarrassed by something your child has done, or you want them to do better than you. Like, you want all good things for them. You want them to succeed at school. You want them to get maybe a job in high school. You want them to be the star on the football team. All these things, right, that parents sometimes want for their child can then turn into expectations. And these might not be expectations that fit the particular child that they're holding them for, right? There also is a lot of pressure that comes from society that I think sometimes dictates the expectations that parents have. So unintentionally, it could be that you're holding expectations for your child that aren't even really true to who you are as a parent or true to what is the best fit for the child that's in front of you. I had 3 kids, right? All 3 of you had different needs, and therefore I had different expectations for each of you. The outcome I want for all of you is the same, right? To grow up and be thriving young humans in charge of your own lives and doing just wonderful things in the world and impacting others. But the way you all got there was very, very unique. So I think, checking in with true friends, right? Family members, people who might know you best. If you're the parent trying to say, oh, I don't know, am I being too tough on my kid? Am I being too lax with my kid? Do I need to have some different expectations? Seeking out a therapist or a counselor might be a good idea if you're really struggling to kind of know what proper expectations are. I think a lack of expectations is also not good. I think a lot of times people don't reach their true potential if no one ever expected them to. And so I think you can allow your child to be part of that journey to defining their own expectations, but the goal needs to be them reaching their full potential. On the flip side of that, I think as a big, and I'll let you comment to both of these, but if you're having expectations of your parents, like I believe as a parent that my children had a right to expect certain things from me, right? They had a right to expect that I would be present whenever I could be and in the best way that I knew possible. They had a right to expect that we were going to work together as a family to make sure all of our basic needs, were being met, whether that was a roof over our heads and foods in our bellies, or whether that was our house being picked up and cleaned because we had to cohabitate with each other, even though we were all busy. There's a lot of expectations that can flow uphill from the bigs to their parents. We've had a lot of conversations in our family because sometimes what you guys saw other kids getting, right, led to you having expectations that were not reasonable for us as your parents, whether that be due to financial station in life, whether that be due to the fact that you had two working parents, whatever that might be.
Mhm.
But I think, for bigs to make sure their expectations are in check, I think you just really need to look at what is it you truly need from your parent. None of us are, princes and princesses probably that are
Mhm.
listening to this podcast. So expecting that level of life is probably unrealistic. So
Mhm.
to me, that's how I would go about looking at if your expectations are appropriate. Is it something the other person is capable of delivering? And is it reasonable? And I think
Mhm.
having a conversation is how you get to that. So, what would you like to add to that, Cade?
For sure. I definitely agree with all of that. And I think as well, kind of just taking a second to ask yourself is just asking yourself the simple question, is my expectation reasonable? Kind of in the example you brought up of sometimes, especially as younger kids, looking at what parents did for either people at school or friends or whatever, and kind of then having that expectation of, oh, well, my friend's parents picked them up and dropped them off at school every day. So like my parent should be able to do that. And obviously, at a young age, you don't have the mindset to be able to have this thought. But then, you kind of have to think, okay, the reason their parents are picking them up every day is because maybe, their mom or their dad stays at home and they're able to pick them up all day, or their parents run their own business so they can decide, when they work and when they don't. And that, isn't the case for us, or whatever that situation may be. I think taking a second just to ask yourself, is my expectation realistic? Is this appropriate? Is this even attainable for my situation? Can really kind of help you gauge where you're at with that. And I think it goes then the opposite way as well. For your parent, or, as a parent setting an expectation for a big, is a lot of times you might look at parents who have an expectation of their kids to do well in school, but that may be because, we're talking about college later in life for bigs, that may be because that the parent is paying for all of their school, and that I think is a fair expectation. Whereas I don't think it is a fair expectation for a parent if you are not helping your child through school in any way, shape, or form, that it is, it's an appropriate expectation for you to have them to be able to succeed. Obviously, yes, you want them to succeed, you want them to get good grades, all of that. But I think having that, firm expectation when you're not helping them, when you're not, there to support them through that journey, how can you have an expectation of them to do it? So I think kind of like I said, just taking a second, stepping back and thinking about, is my expectation reasonable? Is it attainable? And is this something that is feasible for, whoever you have that expectation set for?
Yeah, that right fit I think is really important. Not every young adult is meant to go to college. Not every young adult is desires to go to college. And just because a parent might decide that that's really important to them doesn't mean that that's necessarily going to be the outcome for each kid.
Mhm.
A lot of times when you see young adults failing at things, there is a possibility that there was an expectation put on them and they were trying to fulfill someone else's expectation for them rather
Mhm.
than their own. So I think that, the last thing I would like to say about how do you know if they're reasonable is I think as an individual, even if you're only 15, 16, 17, you can start to have expectations for yourself. And certainly by the time you're in your early 20s, right, you hopefully have a good grasp on what it is you expect of yourself. Sometimes kids expect less of themselves than parents would like to see them expect, but we need to remember it is their journey. I think it can also be said that sometimes there are parents who don't expect enough of themselves, and kids kind of get the short end of the stick in that situation. And so it's just so important to look at each set of parents and big individually, right,
Mhm.
and see what's going on and what might be realistic.
And I think sometimes too that when you kind of mentioned, kids not having, or even just, adults not having expectations for themselves or as high of expectations as someone else might see for them, I think a lot of times that is rooted in the early stages of childhood. If you grow up without a parent or, an older sibling or whoever it is around you that has those high expectations of you, no one is ever gonna, push you to unlock that next level of potential. So if you've gone 18, 20, 25 years of your life and nobody's pushed you, nobody's taught you that there could be more and that you should expect more of yourself, I think it's hard and it's unfair to then expect that adult to then just turn around and be like, oh, I have all these expectations and I know I can accomplish this and accomplish that. And there are those stories of, oh, this person grew up with, no one in their support system and all this stuff, and they, were still able to be successful. But you hear about those, but that is not the majority of people in those situations. So I think that's something important if you're a parent listening to this with younger kids, is to start setting those expectations early. I think, using a school example, the reason why I have high expectations of myself in school is because that was just always taught to us growing up. We always were told we had to get good grades, and that was an expectation that you had for us growing up. So I think, having that expectation as a child and just naturally having that reminder of, okay, I can do better. I have these high expectations of myself. That definitely has helped me to propel myself into success in adulthood.
Yeah, and school was your job when you were little, right?
Mhm.
Like that's the way we explained it. School is your job, but we were also always there to give you the support. Like, how many thousands of hours have I spent practicing spelling words?
Uh-huh.
Like if I was getting paid for each of those words, I'd be a rich woman. But I think you're right. It does start when kids are young, Cade, and but by grace, right? Sometimes kids who don't get it from their parents do get it from other people, teachers, coaches, neighbors, aunts, uncles. So hopefully everybody can find that person in their life who sees the potential in them and can push them a little bit to reach their highest potential and to have those expectations for themselves. So once we've got expectations, right, Kate? So if I have expectations for you as my big, or you have expectations for me as a parent, how do you think it's effective to communicate those? What's the most effective way in your thought?
For sure. I think, for starters, first things first, it's just important to communicate them. I think a lot of times in relationships between bigs and parents, or even just friends or coworkers or romantic relationships, whatever it may be, I think a lot of times we have expectations that we don't communicate. I may think, okay, as my parent, if I am an adult and I'm struggling, you're going to be there to catch me. And that may not be something that you are planning to do as a parent. Or I may think that, as a parent, you have to pay for my health insurance up until I'm 26. And, although you can stay on your parents' health insurance, again, that expectation needs to be communicated, because otherwise you might be 23 and your parents decide to no longer pay for your health insurance, and then you're stuck without it. So I think first things first, it's important to just communicate your expectations in any relationship, but especially in a big and a parent relationship. Because again, you're never going to know my expectations of you. I'm never going to know your expectations of me if we don't have that conversation. And I think, second of all, another part of making that communication effective is making sure that whatever someone else's expectations of you are, that you express that you understand those and how you're gonna, work on that. And is that even attainable? Because, you can come to me all day and tell me what your expectations are of me, but if that's not something I want to do, or if that's not reasonable for me, it's just not going to happen. But if I can sit there and say, okay, you're expecting me to, the example I gave earlier, you're expecting me to get good grades, but you're not helping me in my, college tuition, or just again, as an example, I can then express that I don't feel that that's a fair expectation to have. Or if you have an expectation that I need to, keep my house a certain way and nice and clean and whatever, but you're not helping pay rent or paying any bills there, I can then tell you that that is like an unfair expectation. So I think having that second end of the conversation of whether or not you feel that expectation is fair, whether or not you're able to satisfy that expectation, is an important part of the conversation. But what about you, Mom? How do you think those expectations should be communicated?
Yeah, I agree with both of those. Like if you wait until you're disappointed because someone didn't meet your expectations, you waited too long to have
Hmm.
the conversation. And so then in my estimation, then you don't have a right to be disappointed or to take it out on them. Like you could be disappointed in yourself that you didn't have the conversation, but you shouldn't be disappointed in them for not reaching your expectations because you didn't communicate what that is. I have a friend, shout out Nick, who always says clear is kind. And so it is definitely kind in a loving relationship like this to make sure that your expectations are stated clearly. And I love how you framed it up as, Kate, on the receiving end of someone's expectations, to look at that and be like, is that something that, number one, I feel like they have a right, especially in the case of bigs, right, that are over 18, that they have
Hmm.
a right to have an expectation about my life. It's now my life. I'm an adult. When we're looking at younger kids, even as they're trying to gain their autonomy and they're trying to decide who they are as a person and what that journey looks like, is that something that they're willing to do? Is that something that goes against their grain? Is that something that doesn't feel true to them? And in an ideal situation, there is room for a conversation around that expectation. If a parent says, I expect you to go to this 4-year private college, and instead you as the big is thinking, I would like to become an electrician at the local community college,
Hmm.
hopefully there's room at the table, right, for that conversation. Because like you said, at the end of the day, they're not going to be successful at this private 4-year college if
Hmm.
they're being forced into your expectations rather than following what their heart and their own soul and their own expectations
Hmm.
are telling them to do. So I think, beyond that, the best way to communicate is communicate often.
Hmm.
And again, don't wait, communicate quickly
Hmm.
around this for sure. So I think those are the best ways to
Sure.
communicate expectations.
And that's something I've learned recently is just a lot of times you have an expectation in your head of what someone should do or how they should respond or how they should act. And more often than not, I've found that people are willing to, you know, meet your expectations and, treat you a certain way or respond in a certain way, whatever it may be. A lot of times they're willing to do that. They just don't know that that's expected of them. If you as a parent are wanting your child to be open with you, about let's say their friendships and stuff like that. They just moved to a new city and you're wanting that to be, you're interested in their life. That's a natural thing as a parent. But let's say as a kid, they, every time you call, they just never bring it up and whatever. A lot of times that kid might be open to sharing about their friendships and the new friends they're making. They just didn't know that that was something that you were looking for. So I think a lot of times just having that conversation and expressing those expectations, you'll find a lot more commonly than not, people are willing to meet your expectations or at least meet you halfway. But with that being said, Mom, with that meeting halfway, how do you navigate a conversation like that? If let's say I have an expectation of you and you can't fully meet that expectation, but you might be able to say, okay, I can't give you that, but I'll give you this. How do you kind of navigate that?
Well, I think it's understanding on the receiving end, right? Like, okay, why is this important to you? Why is this something you need, right? Important for me to understand that from you, but also important for me then to realistically say back to you, okay, what I hear you saying is, just to make sure you're on the same page, blah, blah,
Mhm.
blah, right? But I don't feel like I can meet that expectation. Can we talk about some options? And
Mhm.
then if you need to take time apart to think of what those options are, just ask for that time. But then definitely say, okay, let's circle back tomorrow night at 5. Does that work for you? Great. Then tomorrow night at 5, you're going to circle back and you're going to talk about what that expectation middle ground might be, because that's what we're trying to find, right? Because again, this is not a parent working with a 2-year-old, right? Who the 2-year-old has to go to bed, right? 2-year-olds don't always think they have to go to bed, but the parent
Mhm.
is the one in charge. Well, that's not what you're dealing with when you have a 17, 21-year-old, whoever it is in front of you, and you're a parent. Like they are, like we've said, discovering their own autonomy, their own path in this world. They have very strong opinions usually about what feels right to them and what they think they should do. We also know their prefrontal cortexes are not fully formed until they're 25. So sometimes they can't predict the consequences of their actions. And so it's more of a guiding role for parents at that point.
Mhm.
So I think if parents can come to the table more as a guide with their bigs rather than the parent with their thumb on the kid's shoulder, right, pushing them into the chair to do their studying, if that's what the hot topic is of the moment, which I know for a lot of people that is a hot topic. If you can come to find that middle ground, coming at it as a parent from being more of a guide, but then also from the side of a big, respecting the fact that your parents have lived a little while longer than you, they may have some life experience that teaches them that what they're thinking is closer to the truth, right? Is in fact an expectation that you should also potentially look at
Mhm.
for yourself, right? Now, you notice I said look at. it doesn't mean you're going to agree with them fully.
Hmm.
But I think parents are fooling themselves if they think that they can be in a relationship with a big and be enforcing only the parental expectations without there being any conversation with their growing, emerging young adults about what that pathway is going to look like. So that's how I think you need to find a middle ground is really come with an open mind, come with an open heart, be realistic about your ability to meet expectations, but come to the table with options and
Hmm.
take a break if you need to, and then come back for that discussion. How about you, Kate? Anything else you'd add to how to find a middle ground?
For sure, I definitely agree with everything you said. And like you said, being open to it's not just going to be I expect this out of you, and the opposite party is going to say, okay, yeah, sure. That's just not how these conversations are going to go. So being open to, meeting somewhere in the middle or allowing a slow growth of progress. If I tell you I have this expectation and you can say, you know what, I don't know that I can, meet you there, but I'm willing to work on it. Being open to seeing that progress and giving them that grace and allowing them that time to make that progress. It's sometimes hard to make those changes overnight. And I think sometimes it's also okay to accept the fact that there may not be a middle ground to find. Sometimes it just is, I can't meet your expectations. Kind of the example you gave earlier of if a parent is expecting their big to go to a, prestigious 4-year private school and the big just wants to go and become an electrician or a plumber, or they want to go to their local community college, for the first 2 years, or they don't want to go to college at all, whatever, their situation is. I think sometimes it's important to accept the fact that those expectations might not be met, and that's okay. And I think then you need to look at how your relationship changes going forward. Kind of like I talked about earlier, if you're one of those parents that is financially providing for your kid and all of that, I think that, it may be a fair thing then to withdraw financially providing for them if they are not willing to go to school and that is an expectation that you have of them, or whatever it may be. Or if the thing I talked about earlier with a kid sharing, about their, new friendships and things like that. If I didn't want to share that with you for whatever reason, then I think, you need to be accepting of the fact that then that just isn't a conversation that we're going to be having. We can still keep that connection, still keep that relationship, have our phone calls and talk about work and this, that, and whatever. But, just my friendships are off limit in that, that topic. Again, just an example. But I think it's important to, try to find middle ground, try to be flexible, try to look for options in those expectations, but also know that not every expectation is going to be met. And sometimes that's just going to be a no.
Which is a good point. Like it doesn't have to be an all or none, right? And sometimes
Uh-huh.
I think parents don't have that realization. They're like, I am the parent, I am in charge until my child is at least 18 or until I quit providing for them, right?
Mhm.
And you brought up a good point that parents always do have the right after their child is 18 to quit providing financial support. I would caution parents to use that in any way as leverage over your child. Like if you're not giving that financial support from a place of true heart but using it instead to maintain control, you have to consider what your motive is behind doing that, because if you're coming at it from the wrong place, like that's never going to end well either, right? Which brings me to kind of those tense situations. So like you said, Kate, sometimes the answer is just going to be no, right?
Mhm.
Answer is going to be no. So if you've got to diffuse a tense situation, so let's start with maybe someone who's in high school, still living at home, right? And let's say the parent lays down an expectation that, you will not drink or smoke in my house. That's a very, very common issue that families have, right? Lots of kids experiment. I would venture a guess to say for the majority of parents who think their kids aren't, you're wrong. They just get really, really good at hiding it. And so I think, again, being realistic, but if you're going to hit that tense situation where you're saying to your child, you're not doing these things in my home, you can try to say you're not doing these things. But like I said, they're just going to get sneakier about it if they're so inclined to do it, right? You can take away the car, you can take away their phone. There's a lot of things, if you're providing them, a lot of things you can do. But at the end of the day, if you say you're not doing this in my house and they do it in your house anyway, right? That's going to be a really tense situation. Do you have any ideas, Kate? Like, that's just one example, but how if things become really tense around an unmet expectation going either direction between Biggs and their parents, how you might diffuse that?
For sure. I think one part of it is that it circles back to that communicating of the expectations. If you're a parent, communicating that expectation that you're not going to drink or smoke in my house, I think then it is important to express what the consequences of not meeting that expectation are. There's no point in setting expectations if there's no difference in whether I meet it or not. It's the same way of your job has an expectation for you to do ABC because that is in your job requirement, and if you don't do it, you're going to get fired. So I think that kind of goes back to the example you provided where, my expectation is that you're not going to drink or smoke in my house. So then if you do, that may mean that your car is taken away, or, again, if you're providing it, or that your friends are no longer allowed to come over, or you're no longer allowed to play your video games, or whatever sort of consequence that you deem fit, I think is appropriate, but you have to communicate that at some point. You can't just say, okay, this is my expectation, and then a month later you break it, and then now these are the consequences. I think that's important to communicate. And I think having conversations too around that is, let's say you do find your kid, drinking at home or whatever, having that conversation with them about, okay, I gave you this expectation that you weren't going to drink here, and then this is the consequence of it. And I think you do need to follow through with whatever that consequence was. And I think it's kind of up to you, and depending on the relationship and the age of the kid and things like that, to gauge where that lies, where that consequence lies. But I think that just having those conversations about what the consequence is definitely important in navigating those tense situations. So that way there's no feelings of being caught off guard or feeling like, this is an over dramatic response or whatever it is, because at the end of the day, you told me what the consequence was going to be. But what about you, Mom? Because you can obviously speak from a different perspective since you're a parent and you have experienced situations like that. How do you navigate those tense conversations?
So, I think if you have listened to this whole podcast and you start with explaining expectations prior to you being in a situation, right, where someone's gone wrong. So hopefully you didn't go out of town for the weekend, leaving your 17-year-old at home and come home and find out that they had been drinking or smoking in the house. And now you're going to say, my expectation was, and they were not aware of that, right? Hopefully that discussion has happened beforehand. Like you brought up, hopefully the discussion of here's what the consequences would be, right? I do think if you haven't set a consequence prior to that tense moment of having the conflict, I think it's helpful. And I even do this with little kids, like help them come up with what a logical consequence would be. And so if you're doing that, right, you're coming up with this consequence with your teen, either ideally ahead of time, right, or in the moment, again, taking time to think if you need to, but you have a choice to make, because like you said, Kate, if you threaten a consequence, right, and you're not willing to follow it through, or you back down, as a parent, you've just lost all street cred, right? Like you got zero. And so what's going to happen is, if the expectation you've set is not in alignment with what your child intends to do, and you don't follow through on the consequence, you guys are going to keep butting heads over and over and over again about the same issue from now until your child moves out of the house, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you say the consequence is you're no longer going to be allowed to live here, right? You better have done some research to figure out what happens if you tell your 16-year-old that they can no longer live there, right? You better be willing to put some teeth behind what you said you were going to do. So be careful when you're setting those consequences with your kids and really drawing those hard lines in the sand. Because I think if you talk about stuff ahead of time, you know what the consequences are. And then if something happens, and you can sit down and have a conversation where you are not taking your child's not meeting your expectations personally, right? Like, most of the time, kids are not like, oh, I'm going to do this just to make my parent mad. Like, they're doing it because it's what they want to do. They don't want the conflict. They don't want to live in that aggressive tension type of a home all the time. Nobody thrives in that environment, right? There are some people who might like you to think that they do, but in reality, that's all just a ruse, right?
Mhm.
That's not really a productive or environment for anyone. So if you're in that tense situation, I think, taking some time to step back, really examine what you've said so far, what you're going to say going forward, checking it for being realistic, taking breaks if you need to, circling back, being willing to apologize, right? If you were wrong, or you all of a sudden realize you had the reins too tight
Mhm.
and you maybe shouldn't have laid out there what you laid out there as the expectation, you can always be an adult and admit that you made a mistake and that you want to negotiate something new. If it is the kiddo who is trying to hold a parent accountable for an expectation, right, that they had, and things get really tense, kids have choices too, right? Like there's things that they can do, kind of stuck with your parent till they're 18, unless they're really, if things are really bad, right? We know that that's not the typical family we're talking about right now, and that if there's authorities that need to get involved, then by all means there's authorities that need to get involved. But for the parenting situations we're talking about, I think kids also like to do a lot of maybe a little bit of bravado and saying, well, if you don't let me do this, right, then I'm going to run away, or I'm going to, tell all the family you did XYZ, whatever those threats might be, right? And none of that is productive. None of that is going to get you guys where you want to be. So I think anytime you can diffuse those tense situations and not continue to escalate them, and if you are having the same conversations over and over and over again, call a therapist. Get
Mhm.
your family into some family counseling to help you get past that pattern of communication, which is not effective for you. So if we're looking at fair and meaningful consequences, right, Cade, for Biggs, we'll talk about kind of the opposite side of that. But deciding on fair and meaningful consequences, I've known some kids who have had some pretty long groundings. They have had cars taken away. They have had phones taken away. They have not been able to participate in some things that are kind of elemental to me in part of, like, let's say a high school experience or even an early college experience if they're still living at home. And sometimes I think we really need to look at, does the consequence fit the infraction, right, or the expectation that we didn't meet? Does it make sense for your child who's already suffering from social isolation, let's say, if they get a bad grade in a class and you take away their phone, which maybe is their one way to communicate with the one friend that they have at school, is that really reaching your end game, right? Reaching your goal. So I think that deciding on fair and meaningful consequences, I believe, needs to involve your big. And sometimes they're actually harder on themselves than you would be as the parent. But if they've helped to devise, this works, also in business places, if you're the person in charge and you need buy-in from your team, right? If you need buy-in from your teen, it's a really good way to get it by helping them design what that fair and meaningful consequence is. Any thoughts on that, Cade?
For sure, I definitely agree with what you said. I think sometimes the consequence doesn't quite match up with the what happened with the situation. So I think it's important to kind of take a step back and, like you said, think about what is, don't even necessarily think about the consequence, but think about the result of the consequence. So like you said with the phone situation, it's like, okay, the consequence, as a parent, you're just so focused on, okay, they like their phone, let me take it away. And now, like you said, okay, they've lost that connection with, you know, being able to communicate with that one friend. So think about kind of the opposite side of the punishment and how that affects them and then also you, because then you also need to think about if you're taking a car away, then that is maybe you need to be taking them to and from school. And you can also as a parent say then, okay, you need to figure out a way to get to and from school. But depending on the age of your kid, if you're looking at, a 14, 15-year-old kid, it is your responsibility to make sure they get to and from school. So you as a parent can't really just say, okay, I took your car, now you need to figure out a way to get to school. So it's like, okay, great, now your kid doesn't have their car and you took that away from them, but now you have to take them to school every day or you have to drive them down to the bus stop or whatever it may be. So think about the result of the consequence and maybe tweak the consequence. Maybe their consequence is, okay, you can drive your car, but you can only drive to and from school. And you can't use it on the weekends to go to your friend's house or to go to the Friday night football game or whatever the situation may be. Because that, targets them a little bit differently. If it's like, okay, you're still going to school and kind of like you talked about, school is your job. You're still doing what you need to do, but it's taking away that fun aspect of it. And as far as bigs go, I think, as a parent, you lose a lot of that control over your kid once they become an adult. So I think, appropriate consequences in that stage of life are, maybe a distance in your relationship. If, you feel like you guys are just disagreeing, or, you have an expectation for your kid to treat you a certain way and they're not treating you that way, it's okay. And, I'm sure it's hard, but it's okay as a parent to say, okay, if you're not, meeting my expectation of treating me kindly, then, we no longer have a relationship, or, as close of a relationship as we had, or we're not, texting as often or calling as often, whatever it may be. And I think sometimes you have to look at those consequences as, yes, it's hard, but again, it goes back to there's no point of having expectations. There's no point of me saying I have an expectation that you treat me kindly if when you don't, nothing happens.
Yeah, very true. And so what you're kind of talking about, Kate, was setting those limits, right? That's where boundaries come in. And especially when it's an adult to adult relationship, even though you never lose your title as parent and you never lose your role as child, right? It is two adults dealing with each other. And therefore, everybody has a choice on whether or not that relationship continues and what that relationship looks like. So I would caution both sides on that, unless there is a toxic relationship or things that are detrimental to your own mental or physical health, right? Just think through really, really deeply, right? What you might lose in drawing some of those lines, and be willing to lose that.
Mhm.
If you draw that boundary in the sand, just know that is a choice you made. You will probably feel really good about making the choice, but the consequence of that choice may not feel so great.
Mhm.
So just really think it through so that you're doing something that you at the end of the day can live with, right?
Mhm.
But that's the meaningful consequences for bigs, kind of. There's a flip side to
Mhm.
that, right? So, how do you respectfully assert yourself, right? Your own independence, gain autonomy from your parents if you're the big in this situation, Cade, and those parents aren't meeting your expectations. And
Mhm.
this probably be more for a little bit more for older bigs, although if you can think of something for those, mid to late high
Yeah.
schoolers as well, I'd love to hear it.
For sure. I think for older bigs, it's important to remember two things. One, kind of like you talked about earlier, your parent has lived more life than you. They do have more experience in certain aspects. I think there are some things that adults nowadays are not going through that, you guys are the older generation, our parents didn't have to go through. For example, you didn't have to navigate your 20s with social media and, just even the internet. When you were 20, you could go to a job and ask for an application at the front desk and have an interview in 3 days. And now if you did that, you would get laughed at by the front desk receptionist. So I think it's important to remember that yes, they do have more life experience than you, but they also have a different life experience than you do. And they were, an adult in a different time period than you were. So I think that's one thing to, remember. But then also on the flip side, to remember that you are an adult and you do have, autonomy over yourself and your own life. But to then understand that there are consequences to that. If you have an expectation that your parent, you don't want their input on what you do in your career, what moves you make as far as that goes, then you may have to accept the consequences that there may be opportunities that you miss out on or skills that you lack for your career because you don't have that advice from your parents. I know using that example, there's been many a times on a job application where I've said, okay, mom, how should I answer this question? Or how should I negotiate this salary or different things like that? So, that's something that I may not have had access to had we had an expectation that, we didn't talk about my career or whatever it was. So I think it's important to understand that you are an adult and you can make those decisions for yourself, but understanding that there are consequences, and sometimes those consequences can be positive. sometimes, if your parent is constantly in your ear about, your career and you should get this job and you should be doing this, sometimes not hearing that will actually give you a clear mind and allow you to make the moves that you need to make. So consequences don't always have to be a bad thing. It's really just a result of whatever the action was. So I think understanding that you do have that independence, but then accepting the consequences that come with setting those expectations. But what about you, Mom? How do you feel about that topic?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's important for everyone to remember that you can have expectations of people in your family all day long, right? It doesn't mean they have to meet them. And so one of the best books I read this year was by Mel Robbins. It was called The Let Them Theory. And so if Cade has expectations of me that I'm not going to meet, I can let him have those expectations and then I can decide what I'm going to do with that. He can also say, okay, I'm going to let my mom not meet that expectation. I was clear, I was kind. And now I get to decide what I do with that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to completely blow up our relationship. Because if the only kinds of families that stuck together are families where everyone agreed on everything, right? There wouldn't be any. Because
Mhm.
that in and of itself is an unrealistic expectation, right? Everybody's going to have their own ideas. So, I think with kids, being open and honest with your parents, think out your expectations, think out what you're requesting ahead of time. Don't come to the table, coming at them as an ungrateful child who's had pretty much everything handed to them and now wants X, Y, and Z, and not be willing to, hey, I want to take a trip senior year, spring break. I want your credit card so I can pay for everything. And by the way, we're going to Mexico and we're going to be drinking and we're going to be, doing all these things. And if the parent says no, they could be saying no for a variety of reasons. But are you willing to go get a job to help
Mhm.
earn money to pay for your trip? Kind of what are those reasons? So come to the table ready to engage in conversation. And respect goes both ways, right?
Mhm.
Like parents need to respect their kids need to respect their parents, but respect is earned. So
Mhm.
if you act in unrespectful ways, right, towards the other person, you can't expect it to come back at you. So that would kind of be my final word of advice for kiddos
Mhm.
coming to the table, is coming from a place of respect, but knowing that they deserve respect back. So
For sure.
one of the most beautiful parts of successfully parenting bigs is watching them come into their own. It's everybody's goal, right? So it can also be really painful to watch them make their own mistakes and to kind of release that control that you've always had as a parent. But having reasonable expectations for your bigs as they grow from youth to adulthood is a key part of them being confident humans that make good choices once they are fully launched out into the world without you.
For sure. And it is okay to have expectations for yourself that are maybe different than what your parents or others expect of you. Just because other people have expectations of you doesn't mean that that needs to be the expectations you have for yourself. Ideally, there can be negotiation around what constitutes reasonable expectations for bigs, and it's a conversation that involves you and you're able to give your opinion. It is also okay to have expectations of your parents, and if they are communicated well, it may help you get your unique needs met of what you require from your parents. However, your expectations as a big also need to be realistic. Expecting your parents to give you completely free reign or buy you everything you want may not be possible depending on the situation and the relationship you have.
So, not all parents think they should negotiate their expectations or allow their bigs to expect something of them as parents. But I would challenge parents out there to do both. It's really not about being in charge. It's about traveling this journey to your child's adult status in the healthiest way possible for both parties. Every child is unique, as is every parent. There is no manual, and you're both doing this together for the first time as a duo. Remember to stay open, use your resources, discuss those expectations openly, frequently, and respectfully. This can be a growth tool for parents and bigs alike. Remember, you're supposed to be on the same team, but you are different players. Your big is not you. Meet them where they are and work together to find the best possible outcome. Expectations that are clear, kind, and tailor made to your situation. Anything else to add, Cade, before you close us out?
I am good today. Well, friends, that's a wrap for this episode of Raising Bigs. We thank you all for listening today. We hope you found some takeaways, a fresh perspective, and maybe even an action step or two in this episode. Again, we are not experts, but we can authentically share what we're learning in hopes of making the path a little more joy-filled for those who are listening. You can find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. Please subscribe and share with those in your circle who you think might benefit from hearing it.
A new podcast episode comes out every week. You can visit my life coaching website at marcihawkinson.com or email me at lifecoachmarci@gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook at lifecoachmarci and Instagram at life_coach_Marci. Cade, where can our listeners find you?
My handle across all social media platforms is at the Cade Berrigan. That's where you can find me. The best way to contact us or give us feedback is to DM either one of us on social media or to reach out on the Contact Me page on my mom's website. Again, that is marcihawkinson.com. We appreciate any feedback, topic ideas, or questions that you may like to share, and we will see you next time on Raising Bigs.